To be honest, I'm sure that campaign would have raised a lot of money. Like, I'm actually sure that if I sent that out, money would have flooded in. But I was honestly enraged because I knew that in one sense, there's nothing incorrect about this in terms of a fundraising approach or strategy. It's effective, it's going to raise money, it's going to connect with the donor base. But then the other part of me, which is the values driven side, knew that this is complete erasure of our clientele. It's reducing survivors and it's actually going to perpetuate harm. And I'm deeply offended on this for so many other levels. But that's actually very much a common experience, I'm sure. Like, I know this happens day to day. I know millions are being raised with this strategy. And that's what makes it hard to be in that space.
Hi, friends. Ever wondered how you could turn your big ideas into results? Together, let's reimagine a better sector, tackle systemic issues, and yes, raise some serious cash. Welcome back to The Small Nonprofit, the podcast where your passion meets action. Hello, everyone. Welcome back to another episode of the Small Nonprofit Podcast. Today, we're going to be talking about the perfect victim narrative. So I'm sure you've heard of this before, where people are supposed to express gratitude in a certain way. If you're new here, my name is Maria Rio, and I'm a fundraising expert with over 10 years of experience. I'm on a mission to make your life easier so we can raise more funds with less stress. And today, I have an amazing guest to help you do just that. Her name is Esther. Hi, Esther.
Hello. I'm so excited to be here.
So happy to have you. Esther, for people who don't know you yet, who are you? What do you do?
Yes. So, hello, everybody. My name is Esther Sayan Lee. My pronouns are she, her. I am a fundraising and equity strategist, and I do this work to advance justice and mobilize resources to communities through my consulting work, which is Elevate Philanthropy Consulting. I was part of the inaugural Community-Centric Fundraising Global Council. I was part of the interim board at Association of Fundraising Professionals Greater Toronto chapter after it had a public reckoning about anti-Black racism, and I was tasked to develop trust with communities. And I am one of the leaders of the Asian Fundraisers in Canada collective. So all to say, advancing equity, justice, fundraising, how that intersects in our community is something that I do both in my professional and personal life. So I'm excited to chat about this topic. It's been on my mind for quite a bit.
I've thought about this topic too in so many different ways because, as you know, I've been a service user as well. So,
Mhm.
how do you expect people to express gratitude? I live in a World Vision refugee shelter, and World Vision has a child sponsorship model, right?
Yep.
So, kids are expected to write back to the donor and express gratitude. So, for people who might not understand this concept of like the perfect victim or the perfect beneficiary, I would love if you could define it for them.
Yeah, I think the helpful framework to use is actually a term coined by Nils Christie. She was a Norwegian sociologist, and she published a chapter called The Ideal Victim. And she was actually talking about this was in the context of gender based violence, but who gets compassion? Who is someone that deserves our empathy? And there were some characteristics that she outlined that I think would be helpful. And she said society tends to rally around victims who are perceived as weak and or vulnerable, seen as respectable or doing the right thing, have been harmed by a clearly bad offender, and they're not connected to the offender. And the instance she gave was like a little old lady that gets robbed by someone that's taking their money for drugs or alcohol. And that was an example that she was using to define intercultural context. And I think it's a good jumping off point for us. I don't think it's complete, but it's something that I think about, which is who deserves our compassion. And when we talk about nonprofit sector, I think there's a lot of overlap in this where you go, we serve homeless people, but it's people that are sober and it's people that really are grateful for this, or it's just women and children who had nowhere to go, or they never had government assistance, or they're just really down on their feet, but they're looking for a job. There's so many ways that we imply bias and we basically categorize who is more deserving of care and who isn't. And I don't think anybody would say, no, of course, I think everyone deserves help. But I actually think if you examine enough nonprofit communications, I would argue that you are platforming some ideal version of your client base or you're starting to try and hide or maybe talk less about the complexity of the clients that we serve. I think sometimes we reduce people that we're serving and the communities we serve to fit a idealized version that we feel or our donors would feel comfortable supporting.
It's interesting because nonprofits can perpetuate that for sure. But I think a lot of them start from a place of we have an unsexy cause, right? Like we work with a population that's not traditionally experiencing empathy from the general public, and that's hard to fundraise around, right? So you want it to be as easy for people to feel empathetic. And I think that that's that societal issue being reflected in how we do our work. Would you agree?
Yes, I think it perpetuates white supremacist, racist, colonial ideologies of who deserves our respect. It's a matter of respectability politics. And the thing is, when you say, I want it to be accessible, if a nonprofit goes, I want this to be accessible, I want people to understand this, I want it to emotionally resonate with them, you are still spinning the narrative. If your clientele base is more diverse than that, you're spinning the narrative to elicit compassion or empathy because you're understanding that your donor base will be more likely to give you money if it's this type of person versus another. So, the reason this has been on my mind a lot, for some background, for those of you that don't know me, I'm a literature nerd. And before I went into fundraising, I thought I was going to be this like really pretentious feminist professor somewhere in the US, like talking about gender, race, and sexuality and just being a big nerd about it. And actually, a lot of my work was around narrative and literacy and how we represent people. And when I came to a shelter, it was a first women's shelter in Toronto to have pets. It was interesting to me that when I talked about the pets, it was so much easier to raise money when I talked about, "Oh, we also shelter dogs and cats," like, I would put it as an aside, but I did notice this huge pattern of every time I talked about the pet, it was like money would come pouring in. And then when I talk about the fact that our clientele base is newcomer, refugee, immigrant, we're a harm reduction shelter, there's a lot of systemic issues that they're dealing with, not as much response. And it wasn't something that surprised or shocked me, it was more that it really affirmed what I knew in such a clear data-driven way that people are more comfortable when they think that the clients we serve are true victims in their mind, like they're deserving of this care, like a pet. We project whatever emotions we want on them and we think they didn't do anything to deserve this. Whereas if we have a client and a survivor who is, going through substance abuse, may not be the perfect parent, may not be the perfect or ideal survivor, whatever you want to think that is, it's a much more complex discussion to have. And I have to say, as a fundraiser, it was very clear which way I could go to raise money quickly. But the cost of that is that I am also perpetuating a very biased perspective of what survivors look like, who should support them, and whether they deserve our care. So I think, yes, if you think about it in a revenue way, sure. I know that there's an easy connection. Some stories are easier to tug at the heartstring. So it's easier to connect with people. They might understand this better. People might not understand substance use or growing up in poverty in our donor base, all of that, sure. The cost of that is that you're limiting and reducing the perception of survivors. And I think that's a greater cost that we should assess.
So at the time when you were doing this fundraising around like pets and people who are experiencing homelessness who now have to live in a shelter, were there like red flags that you were kind of like, wait, what is happening? Why are we telling the story this way? That kind of alerted you to the fact that there needed to be a change? Or how did you kind of discover that?
I would say traditionally, especially in gender-based violence, it's this white feminist model of kind of not seeing the intersectionality of this work or systemic issues. And when I first came in, I was lucky enough to have a director that was trying to shift things towards the equity lens. That wasn't something that I ever had trouble doing. And then when I started leading the department, it was something that was very much a priority. But when I started to see what other shelters were doing and how they were portraying it, that's when I started to really realize just how broad this issue is and how comfortable everybody was talking about women. They would words like battered women, trying to hide the fact that they're a harm reduction space or have a harm reduction program, really elevating or plastering children all over it. Or even the opposite, constantly using the images of BIPOC women to elicit or connect with that community, but never really including them in any other means. Actually, one incident, we had an outside contractor develop a campaign for us, and they interviewed me and my team, who are all survivors, women of color, and we gave them extensive information about what we hoped this campaign to be, how we want it to be intersectional, reflective of the clients we serve, like speaking to our experience as employees and as from a survivor's perspective. It resulted in a email campaign. Sorry, it was a direct mail campaign. Well, the first time I opened it, there was a cartoon of a dog, and the whole appeal hinged on the fact that we were the first and only at the time women's shelter that provided a pet kennel. That was about 4 hours of discussion. I'd say another 3 of me really explaining, like, the direction we've gone. That was the result. And to be honest, I'm sure that campaign would have raised a lot of money. Like, I'm actually sure that if I sent that out, money would have flooded in. But I was honestly enraged because I knew that on one sense, there's nothing incorrect about this in terms of a fundraising approach or strategy. It's effective. It's going to raise money. It's going to connect with the donor base. But then the other part of me, which is the values driven side, knew that this is complete erasure of our clientele. It's reducing survivors and it's actually going to perpetuate harm. And I'm deeply offended on this for so many other levels. But that's actually very much a common experience, I'm sure. Like, I know this happens day to day. I know millions are being raised with this strategy. And that's what makes it hard to be in that space or nonprofit in general is how are we actually thinking about who deserves compassion? And I mean, across all human service sectors. Who do we decide and what biases and assumptions are you making? And I'm not going to take we made money as a justification for it. But unfortunately, that's actually not as common as it should be.
I think what you're sharing is also so core to community centric fundraising. Like the end doesn't justify the means. The means are very, very important, if not as equally important as the end, if not more important than the ends. So that's really interesting. A lot of EDs might hear this and say, like, well, what is the harm with leading with the dogs if it's new? So, how can our listeners see if this is an issue at their organization and start moving towards a more equitable way of portraying people?
I think you have to assess the cost of this. So, like, that's my main thing I would say to ED. If you only take revenue as the cost and you're not thinking about the risk of the trust you're building with your community or your staff, or whether you're actually aligning with your values, that's a cost that you can't ever really hope to fix. So, for me, it's kind of like, what metrics are you using? Is the first question I would ask. If you're just going by money, and sure, if you have a new pet program and you want to share it, that's fantastic, but are you leveraging that in a way? Like, what stories are you erasing? What kind of image are you portraying of your survivors? Why are you leaving them out? I do want to provide some action items because I know the audience is a lot of folks that are interested in community-centric fundraising, a lot of folks that want to do better and align more with equity. First thing I would actually say is center the people you serve. That sounds extremely simple, but it's not. It takes a long time. You got to build trust with them. You got to make sure consent policies are in place. You got to make sure that you're aware of the power dynamic of you as an organization asking your client for a story. This is a lot of deep internal work, so don't underestimate that. The second thing I would say is audit your storytelling practices. Think about who gets featured in your newsletters, in your grant applications, whose testimonials are you sending? Are you sharing the full scope of the challenges? If you're in any sort of human services organization, for even for like a minute, you know the complexity of these systems. You know how systemic it is. You know that it's not just homelessness, it's also poverty, it's also food insecurity, it's also possibly domestic partner violence. There's so many things that are going on here. So let's be clear about that to everybody. It's not just about who you're platforming. So the pet example is a great one. Sure, you want to talk about the pets. That's fantastic. But what's then getting left out? What is your other programs and why are you scared to talk about it? And who are you trying to cultivate in your donor base that you're scared to do this? The other thing I would say is really just build trust. Like I always say, like the work moves at the speed of trust. And what I mean by that is when you talk about, when I said assess the cost and the trust you might lose, it's not always apparent and someone might not always complain about it, but you should always be aiming to hold that trust with as much integrity and care as it deserves. If you have people using your services, they're trusting you to have their best interests. So if that's the case, then operate in that way. And even internally as a staff, would you be willing to talk to your fundraiser and say, like, actually, I think this is verging on exploitative, or I think it's actually starting to exclude this, or it's actually reducing the complexity of our work? Would your board be able to say that? Would you be able to say it internally? Like, I actually question that. And even with your funders, who are you leaving out in these stories, and what kind of image or portrayal are you trying to show them? Because if you really are trying to change these systems and work ourselves out of a job, as we always say, then obviously we need to connect it to the larger systemic issues. And if we're not able to do that, even with a funder that has obviously chosen to invest and partner with us, I don't think we have much hope. And that's really the hope in all of this, is that we want to build partnerships.
I think that's really interesting because one path entrenches your organization more. Like if you talk about the dogs, people kind of like feel, oh, happy, great, they're doing something good. It has the same feeling as a like a sitcom episode. They had a problem, they have a solution, everything is good now. The other way, like not talking about the dogs, actually can lead to real systemic change because you're bringing people along, you're doing that donor education, you're helping them understand the complexity and the layers of the issue.
Yes. I'll be honest, when I skated over this, but that transition, we're one of Toronto, it was one of Toronto's oldest women's shelters. The audience and donor base weren't necessarily, no one's ever talked to them from our organization about how, talk about white supremacy openly, talk about racism, talk about refugees, talk about how majority of our clients are poor and there's so many barriers to social assistance. Nobody had talked about that. So I won't lie, there was in some ways backlash about this shift, about like, why are you always having to bring these like larger topics up? Like, I just want to help someone in a shelter. And it was like, we can't talk about this without connecting the dot, because this matter of there's a lack of infrastructure. This is, shelters are one part of the solution for this, but it's going to take multiple approaches, multiple solutions to even make a dent in the housing crisis in Toronto. One question we would always get is, how quickly do women leave the shelter? You know, that was almost a weird metric of success, of like they stayed for a short time and then they found employment and got their house. The reality is that housing for a single parent in Toronto is extraordinarily high. Finding employment after you've been under many years of abuse and possibly control, where you didn't even have access to your bank account, and then you're being told to file your taxes and source employment, it's kind of ridiculous. But if we are not clear in educating our donors about that, that's kind of what they expect as a metric of success. We have to build some level of literacy around what success looks like. And that is on us as nonprofit workers to educate the donors and bring them along on all aspects of this, so that we can actually have partnership. And so that when I tell you, you know, our rates of women come into shelter, residents come into the shelter, and it takes double the whatever industry standard time is. You won't blink at that because you actually understand the systemic and contextual issues that might contribute to that.
We talked about some actionable things that people can start doing. What do you hope people take away from this episode?
I don't think you can separate politics from nonprofit work. And I think anybody that thinks they can do that, again, is reducing the work we're doing. To me, fundraising is movement building. That's how I have to position and locate myself in it. That's a very personal definition of it. I don't think everybody has to locate themselves in the work that way. But for me, I had a hard time entering this sector without clarity about how it relates to justice. So for me, every fundraiser should be a movement builder. And if you're a movement builder and you're someone that actually cares about addressing the root causes, not just a band-aid solution or just getting, you know, enough for, so that your organization floats by and the cause isn't actually addressed. Like if we're actually looking at it in a collective matter rather than an individualist one, then we need a seismic change. And this isn't just about communications or ethical storytelling. And I don't want someone to listen to or watch this and go, oh, okay, I know ethical storytelling. What I'm really asking folks to do is have that critical self-examination of what biases you have, because we all have them. Who is a deserving person? Who deserves our compassion? And I'll tell you, especially in this day and age, when we're getting fed so much AI generated deepfake content, we don't know who is right. We don't know what truth is. And that's a scary thing to say when truth is relative. We have to really develop a critical muscle to be able to determine what biases we may consciously or unconsciously be perpetuating. And that onus is on us as individuals, especially if you're a leader of the organization. It's up to you to set the tone. Some examples of just how critical media literacy is when we talk about Hurricane Katrina in New Orleans, right? There was a lot of media outlets that portray, if it was photos of predominantly Black people, they would say that people in New Orleans are looting. And then if it was photos of predominantly white people, they would say they were finding food. There's a little slight difference in vocabulary. And unless you really put it together, which news doesn't come like that, doesn't come where we can start to see the pattern, like it didn't have these articles side by side. We are unconsciously consuming journalist biases. We're unconsciously consuming everyone's biases all the time. And that's the scary thing I have to say is that I think a lot of folks that have been in the sector, especially for a long time, we might have consumed a lot of this that we don't even think about it. It's like second nature. Like I'm sure there were folks that could have read a campaign and like thought like this is a great campaign. It's really going to connect with folks about the pets. I'm glad we're talking about them. We're the first shelter to do it. So great. But I think that's what alarms me is like, when do we give ourselves the time to reflect, critically examine, be in community, to call each other in, call each other out, actually revise our practices? If I'm really honest, the main action I would say is budget time for every part of this process, budget time for yourself to reflect, budget time to think about media literacy or reviewing communications historically from your organization or from others and start to develop that literacy to say, what is the perception of an ideal client that we are serving? Maybe we didn't do it like consciously, and that's okay. It's still our responsibility to fix it.
I think it's interesting because tying it back to the like sexy cause, a sexy cause is one that is perceived as less political because that is how they're selling it, right? Like I've done a lot of work in food insecurity, and
Yeah.
in those spaces, we only talk about food. We don't talk about the companies that are paying minimum wage that are donating money to
Mhm.
the food bank, but whose staff are working there and having to use the food bank, right?
Mhm.
So, like, I feel like the sexy causes are equally unsexy as the other causes if you add those politics back in, which we should be doing to bring people along and to like portray people as more than just this one dimensional character in our story, not even their story.
Yeah, and I think it goes back to what's your goal? Like, is your goal like, I know if we said that to a food security organization, they'd be like, "Well, we wanna, end hunger. Like, we don't want anybody to be hungry." Okay, great. Do you think that's possible just by providing food, or do you think it has to be that we attach the political lens to it and make sure everybody understands that this is not an individual failing, but it actually a systemic issue that we could like poverty should actually just not exist, and therefore food insecurity should just not exist. It's just that we're not in the place where we're ready to acknowledge that. There's a lot of reasons that we go towards an individualistic lens. I mean, we're in late stage capitalism, the world is on fire, so many things I could say. But it's kind of that individualist lens that makes us forget what the collective vision is. And I think that's what I would urge organizations, departments to do, like really hinge it on the collective vision. There is no issue I can think about in nonprofit that is not in some way, shape, or form systemic. And by erasing that, I do think one, as a donor, if someone was to try and like say like we just do, it's very simple, we just do this, I would actually feel a little offended because I would know that there's more issues than that. But also too, it's not real partnership. If I only give you like one quarter of the story that I think will appeal to you, it's not really someone that I'm building a relationship with. I'll tell you, like I said, there was backlash, but also when I came into the shelter work and I started leading it, it was also like I increased the annual revenue by 51% over 2 years. I helped co-develop a language guide that's now a resource available for shelters across Canada through Women's Shelters Canada digital resource that precisely tackles the language about battered women, why we talk about strong women or put something about resilience around BIPOC women. We went through all of that in this language guide. This is the kind of impact we should all try to be aiming for, which is how do we scale equity? How do we support each other? How do we collaborate? Because we all have a shared goal of ending this specific issue. So I don't usually like to talk about the revenue because that's what people always ask when I talk about CCF or equity. They go, but what about the money? But what about the money? Instead of asking about the money, ask about the cost and ask about the risk of losing trust with their community, with their staff members. Ask yourself what the shared vision is and if this actually goes towards that and your proposed values or not. I think we do ourselves a disservice by operating out of fear of losing our donor base instead of actually imagining what it could be like to have a donor base that are true partners with us. Because I've seen it, you've seen it. When you really have a partnership where you can be as frank as we are and transparent as we are about how we are all complicit in perpetuating harm, it just makes for a more honest conversation. And it makes so that we're actually mobilizing communities. And that's what community-centered fundraising is about. That's what fundraising in equity and justice is about.
I think that was a great answer. I'm tempted to just end it right there, but I do have one more final question for you, Esther, because I feel our executive directors will be listening to this, or maybe your fundraisers who have told stories in a very like sanitized, non-political, effective way for fundraising. Some people might kind of think about this topic and say, like, well, is telling the story in this manner re-traumatizing for the person who's sharing the story or maybe the donor who's reading the story? I'm sure there's a way to do that without re-traumatizing either the storyteller or the listener, but I'd love to hear your thoughts on that.
Yeah, I think that's a great question. And I'm sure people are thinking that. The first thing I'll say is there is no such thing as a safe space. We're all in this world. We're all going to perpetuate harm. We're all going to be hurt by others. That's a reality. So I would never purport to say that I know how to provide a perfect communication or perfect space that might not trigger or hurt someone. And I think we need to let go of that idea that we can do that first. That's my first response to that. The second thing I want to say is it's I actually have a client that does legal services for parents and children, but they primarily serve parents that are interacting with the child welfare system, meaning they're either at risk of losing their children or they've already been separated from their children. And they have a program called Mentor Parent where people that have gone through this had their children taken away from them, worked hard to rebuild, and actually got them back, which is quite rare to do. And they actually sit with the parents that are going through this and say, I've been through this. I'm with you. I'm walking with you. And it's a really amazing program, right? I've been interviewing them for stories, and I actually talked to someone yesterday, and they said, sometimes the hardest part about this work is that it's an echo of my trauma. It's an echo of what I've been through. And sometimes that can be immensely healing because I see outcomes that I didn't have at first. And sometimes it can be extremely painful. And I was listening to this and I thought to myself, this is what kinship is. There's a term from Gregory Boyle called radical kinship, where he says it goes beyond solidarity, it's kinship. And when I was hearing this mentor parent speak, I could hear this sense of I'm standing with you, I'm walking with you. And it was only possible because he was telling his story on his own terms with full autonomy, full decision making, full consent. He owned his story and he was using it as a powerful tool for connection. That's why it always comes back to, are we centering the people we serve and making the parameters so that they can own their story? So my answer to that would be, are we probably going to trigger people? Will this be hard to read? Absolutely. And if we are centering people's authentic stories in a way that they have decided to, we're also providing the platform and opportunity for people to testify to their experience, to their life, to share it and use that to connect. And I don't think we are the ones that are deciding when it's appropriate, how to do it. You leave it up to them and then you go forward from there.
That's true. I always love hearing your wisdom. You're a very, very wise person, and I'm so happy to introduce you to this audience. For people who want to continue the conversation, want to know more about what you do, what you think, where can they find you?
Sure. So I'm chronically online on LinkedIn, unfortunately. There's a lot of jokes and memes, and sometimes I rant about the sector. So I would definitely connect there. I love meeting new folks and connecting with them and hearing about what bothers them. You can also go on my website, elevatephilanthropyconsulting.com. And yeah, just connect. I would love to hear your thoughts.
Thank you so much for sharing your wisdom with the audience and for really bringing forward how we can live those community-centric fundraising values and think differently about the work to be more reflective of where it needs to go to actually be systems change rather than just fundraising.
Absolutely.
And thank you for listening to another episode of the Small Nonprofit Podcast. Like always, you can see our lovely faces on YouTube, but I hope that you're learning so much from this episode and you're able to implement this kind of narrative shift into how you're going to shift hearts and minds, right? That's something that we always say. And now we have a really good opportunity to do so. So I hope you go out there and do it. That's it for today. See you next week. Bye for now.
Thank you for listening to another episode of The Small Nonprofit. If you want to continue the conversation, feel free to connect with our guests directly or find me on LinkedIn. Let's keep moving money to mission and prioritizing our well-being. Bye for now.